Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Deer Biologist. I've been a wildlife biologist for the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources for 16 years. I want to tell you about the deer. Before I do, let me tell you what my job actually involves, because wildlife biologist sounds like something pleasant, hiking through pretty forest counting animals, and the reality of it in West Virginia's remote counties is something different enough that the gap between the two matters for what I'm about to describe. West Virginia is the second most forested state east of the Mississippi and one of the least densely populated states in the eastern United States. Its remote counties, the ones in the eastern highlands, the ones in the southern coal fields, the ones along the borders with Virginia and Kentucky where the hollows run deep and the ridgelines run steep and the access roads are the kind that county maintenance hasn't gotten to in several years, are genuinely isolated in a way that most people who've never worked in that terrain don't appreciate. I've been in hollows in southern West Virginia where the nearest paved road was 40 minutes by ATV, where the cell phone signal disappeared 3 ridges back, where the only sign that anyone had been there in the recent past was a hunting camp last used years ago. That is the terrain I've been working for 16 years, as one of the DNR biologists responsible for deer population monitoring, habitat assessment, and the long-term biological data that informs the state's management of its white-tailed deer herd. Deer management in West Virginia is serious business. The state's whitetail population is one of the most intensively monitored ungulate populations on the East Coast, with decades of harvest data, population modeling, disease surveillance, and field assessment that collectively constitute one of the more complete pictures of deer ecology in the region. My job is a small part of that picture, running camera trap networks, doing population surveys, assessing habitat quality, processing harvest samples from check stations during hunting seasons, and monitoring disease status in my assigned region, which covers a substantial chunk of the state's southern highland counties. The deer I work with are not the suburbanized whitetails of the mid-Atlantic corridor who eat landscaping and make eye contact with humans over back fences. They are the deer of genuinely remote highland forest, animals with minimal human exposure that behave the way deer behave when they haven't had generations of contact with human beings to habituate their responses. Wild, in the specific sense of that word, that means something different from simply living outdoors. I've been watching those deer for 16 years. I know their behavior the way I know my own hands. What I noticed starting in year 8 isn't something I can fully explain. What I can tell you is that I've been trying to explain it for 8 years, and I've run through every explanation the biological sciences offer, and I haven't found one that fits all the data. But I need to start at the beginning, because the beginning is important for understanding how much I had to see before I was willing to call what I was seeing what it actually was. The first indication came in my 8th year, during the pre-rut population assessment in October. I run a network of trail cameras across my study area, a grid of about 40 cameras covering roughly 60 square miles of forested highland in the southern part of my region, and I pull the cards every 2 to 3 weeks during the active season to track movement patterns, population size estimates, buck-to-doe ratios, and general activity levels. The data from those cameras, accumulated across 8 years by that point, gives me an extremely detailed picture of what the deer in my study area are doing at any given time of year. In October of year 8, the cameras in the northeastern section of my grid, a cluster of 12 cameras covering a specific ridge and hollow system that I'd always considered some of the best deer habitat in my study area, produced data that didn't match anything in 8 years of prior records. Not in numbers, which were within normal range. In behavior, Deer on trail cameras behave in predictable ways that, after years of watching the footage, become as legible as text. Feeding behavior, social interaction, bedding approach, movement direction, the specific body language of different states, alertness, curiosity, relaxed travel, flight response. All of these are identifiable in camera footage, and all of them follow patterns that any experienced wildlife professional can read. What the cameras in the northeastern section were showing in October of year 8 was deer behaving in ways that didn't match any of these categories. The most distinctive footage was from a camera positioned near a scrape site in a hollow bottom, a high-activity location that had been one of my most productive cameras for several years. The footage from that camera showed deer approaching the scrape from the usual direction, getting within approximately 30 to 40 feet of the camera, and then stopping. Not stopping to sniff or look around in the way deer do when they've detected a disturbance. Stopping and turning, facing back the way they'd come, standing very still, and then leaving. Without working the scrape, without any visible stimulus from the camera or from the surrounding environment. I watched close to 4 hours of footage from that camera over 2 weeks in October, and the pattern was consistent. Deer approached, stopped at the same approximate distance, turned, left. One after another, across multiple days, in behavior that had no precedent in 8 years of footage from that same location. I changed the camera angle, tested the camera for malfunction, checked for any structural change in the immediate environment that might explain a new behavioral cue. Found nothing. By November, the footage had returned to normal. Deer working the scrape in their usual manner, the behavioral anomaly apparently resolved, and I filed it as unexplained and moved on. I filed too many things as unexplained in the years that followed. By year 12, I had a file on my personal laptop labeled simply anomalies that contained close to 200 documented incidents across the northeastern section of my study area that I'd been unable to account for with any standard biological explanation. Not 200 dramatic incidents. Most of them were small things, the kind of thing that seems explainable in isolation and starts to look like a pattern only when you're looking at hundreds of them across 4 years. Deer avoiding locations they'd previously used heavily, then resuming use with no apparent change in conditions. Camera triggering events with no visible animal in the frame. Seasonal distribution patterns that shifted without corresponding changes in habitat or forage availability. And, beginning in year 10, something new. Physical observations during field visits that I've never fully committed to paper in any official record. I want to describe those physical observations now, with the precision they deserve, because the anomalies file is one part of the story and the field observations are another part, and together they add up to something that I haven't found a way to report through any official channel without the report being handled in a way that wouldn't produce anything useful. Year 10, November, deer season. I was checking camera cards in the northeastern section, a 3-day field visit that I was doing alone because my field assistant was on family leave and the work needed to be done before the cards filled. I was in the hollow bottom near the old scrape site, the same location where the behavioral anomaly had started in year 8, and I found something on the ground that I spent close to 20 minutes trying to identify before I gave up and photographed it and moved on. It was a deer, or it had been. The carcass was recent enough that I could confirm the species and the general size. An adult doe, reasonably healthy body condition based on what was visible. What I couldn't account for was the state of the carcass, which did not match any predation or scavenging pattern I'd encountered in 16 years of processing deer mortality in West Virginia. I've processed hundreds of deer carcasses, from vehicle strikes to hunter kills to predation events to disease mortality, and I have a functional reference for what a carcass looks like under different cause of death and post-mortality scenarios. What I was looking at didn't match any of them. The carcass was almost entirely intact. No major consumption by scavengers, which in West Virginia's hollow bottoms happens within 48 hours of mortality in the warmer months, and within a week even in November conditions. The apparent damage to the animal was not consistent with predation. No canine bite marks, no claw marks, no evidence of the specific attack patterns of the predators capable of taking an adult deer in that region, which are limited to black bear and coyote. And the specific nature of the damage was something I've spent 6 years since trying to find a comparable case for in the literature and haven't found one. I'm not going to describe it in graphic detail, partly because this account doesn't need it, and partly because the specific nature of it is something I've been advised by the one colleague I trust enough to have shown the photographs to, not to put in any written form that might be associated with my professional standing. What I'll tell you is that whatever killed that deer did so in a way that left no marks consistent with any predator native to West Virginia, and left the carcass in a condition suggesting something had been done to it that served no biological purpose that I can identify in the normal framework of predator-prey interaction. I photographed the carcass extensively. The photographs are in the anomalies file. I noted the location to within 10 meters using my GPS unit. And I spent the walk back to my truck running through every explanation I had, including the ones I normally dismiss as insufficient: poaching with an unusual weapon, a novel predator, a disease pathology I hadn't encountered before, and found none of them sufficient. The second physical observation came in year 11, and this one I have to tell you about differently because it involved another person. My colleague at the DNR, I'll call her Lisa because she's still employed there and hasn't asked to be named publicly, was doing a habitat survey in the adjacent section, about 6 miles from my northeastern grid, when she called me on the radio with a question she framed as, "Do you have a minute? I want to ask you about something weird." Lisa has been doing wildlife biology in West Virginia for 14 years. She does not call things weird. She is one of the most precise and careful field professionals I know, and the qualification weird was already enough to make me listen carefully. She described what she was looking at, a section of forest in the hollow below her survey transect where the deer sign had completely disappeared. Not diminished, disappeared. An area of roughly 40 acres that should, based on the habitat quality and her prior surveys, have been holding 8 to 12 deer in normal distribution, showed no sign of deer activity whatsoever. No tracks, no trails, no browse lines, no beds, no scat. The area looked, she said, like it had been evacuated. I asked how long the avoidance had been in place. She said she didn't know. It was her first visit to that specific location, but that the absence of sign was so complete that some of the natural browse recovery she was observing in the understory suggested the area hadn't been used by deer in several months at minimum. I drove to her location that afternoon. The section she described was exactly what she'd said: 40 acres of prime deer habitat with no deer activity. We walked the perimeter of the avoidance area, and I noted the approximate boundary. Then I checked the GPS coordinates against my own study area's data and realized that the 40-acre section Lisa had found was adjacent to, on the southern edge of, the northeastern cluster of my camera grid where the behavioral anomalies had been concentrated for 3 years. 2 field biologists, 6 miles apart, in adjacent sections of the same general landscape, had both been documenting behavioral anomalies in the deer population of the same specific area of forest. She'd found the avoidance zone. I'd been finding the upstream edge of it, the behavioral response in deer approaching the area before they turned away. We sat in her truck for a while and compared notes. Neither of us had been talking to the other about what we'd been observing because neither of us had been talking to anyone about it, for the same professional reasons. What we discovered in that truck was that the combined picture of our two separate observation sets described something considerably more coherent and considerably more alarming than either individual set suggested on its own. The deer in a specific section of southern West Virginia's highland forest were avoiding a specific area with a consistency and completeness that no biological variable we could identify accounted for. The avoidance had been developing for at least 3 years in the observable data. The boundary of the avoidance zone, as best we could map it from 2 separate data sets, was approximately consistent with a central point from which the avoidance radiated. And the carcass I'd found in year 10 was inside the avoidance zone, close to its apparent center. Lisa said something in that truck that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Whatever is in that area has either driven the deer out or scared them out, and I've been doing this long enough to know the difference." Predators drive deer out. Deer don't move en masse out of prime habitat and leave it completely empty for months because of predator pressure. Predator pressure shifts distribution patterns. It doesn't produce a vacancy this complete. She was right, and we both knew she was right. And we sat in the truck and didn't say anything for a while, because the logical next step in the reasoning, if it isn't predator pressure, what produces complete vacancy in prime habitat across 40 acres for months, was not a step that either of us was ready to take out loud in a professional context. I want to tell you about year 12, because year 12 was when the deer stopped being the main subject. I was doing a night drive survey in the northeastern section, the kind of survey where you drive slow roads in the dark with a spotlight to count and classify deer by sex and age. Standard population assessment technique gives you a quick population index across a road network you can repeat across seasons and years to track trends. I'd been doing those drives in that section for 8 years. I knew every section of road on the circuit. About 2/3 through the drive, on a section of gravel road that ran along the edge of the hollow system that had been producing anomalous data for 4 years, the spotlight caught something at the road's edge that wasn't a deer. It was large. It was dark. It was upright in a way that nothing in West Virginia's fauna is upright for the sustained, habitual period I had to observe it before it moved. I had the vehicle stopped and the spotlight on it for perhaps 8 seconds, and in those 8 seconds I observed height exceeding anything in the local fauna, arms or forelimbs of a length and proportion that I could compare to known species and find no match for, and a face, or what was in the position where a face should be, that was oriented toward my vehicle and my light with the specific quality of directed, aware attention that distinguishes a thing that is looking at you from a thing that is simply turning toward a stimulus. Then it stepped off the road into the hollow timber, not running. Not the flight response of a spooked deer or the rapid departure of a startled bear. Walking, deliberately, 1 step off the road edge into the trees, and it was gone. I sat at that section of road for close to 20 minutes. The spotlight stayed on where it had been standing. Nothing came back to the road edge. Nothing moved in the timber in a way I could see or hear. I turned the spotlight off, turned it back on, swept the road edges in both directions. Nothing. I drove the rest of the survey circuit on automatic, recording the deer counts without the full attention they deserved, and drove back to the field cabin I was using that week, and I sat at the small table in that cabin for a long time before I opened my laptop and typed the observation into the anomalies file. Large bipedal animal, dark coloration, estimated height significantly exceeding all known local fauna. Observed at road edge, approximately 2 seconds before spotlight contact, approximately 8 seconds in spotlight. Departed by single step into hollow timber, No subsequent sound or movement observed. Location, GPS coordinates. Time, 23:14. I closed the laptop and looked at what I'd just written. I'd been keeping the anomalies file for 4 years. What I'd just written was the first entry in it that I couldn't contain within the language of behavioral ecology. Everything else in the file was about deer doing things deer shouldn't do, camera triggering without visible animals, habitat avoidance patterns. What I'd just written was about something that wasn't a deer and wasn't any other animal I had a category for. Year 13 was when I talked to the old man. There is an informal network among wildlife professionals in West Virginia, like the informal networks in every professional community, of people who've been in the field long enough to have knowledge that doesn't fit into any official report format, but that gets passed along through trusted channels anyway. I'd been part of that network long enough to know who to ask when I had a question I couldn't ask officially. And the person I went to with the specific question of what was in the hollow in the northeastern section of my study area was a retired DNR biologist named Harold who'd worked the southern counties for 31 years and who had the specific authority of long tenure and official retirement to say things that people still employed couldn't say. Harold listened to everything I told him. The behavioral anomalies, the avoidance zone, the carcass, Lisa's confirmation, the road edge sighting. He was quiet throughout, which was notable because Harold is not a quiet man. When I finished, he was quiet for another minute, and then he said, "Which hollow?" I told him. He said, "I pulled camera cards from that hollow in my last 3 seasons. I stopped putting cameras there in my 28th year. I stopped going there alone in my 29th. And I retired at 31 and didn't say why." He paused, and I let the pause sit. He said, "There's a woman in the county, been there her whole life. Grandmother was born in that hollow before the families moved out. Name is Maddie. I'll give you her number. Don't call her. Go see her. Tell her I sent you." He gave me the number. He didn't say anything else about it. We talked about deer management for a while, and then I drove home. I went to see Maddie 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in March. She lived in a small house near the county seat, mid-70s, sharp, and the moment I said Harold's name, she nodded in a way that told me she'd been expecting someone to come eventually. I described what I'd been observing in the hollow: the deer avoidance, the camera anomalies, the road edge sighting. I described it in the careful, factual language of a field professional. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother's people called it the thing that walks by dark." That's the translation. There's no good English word for it. She said it in the flat, informational tone of someone relaying an old fact rather than telling a ghost story. They moved out of that hollow in 1923. They'd been there since the 1850s. 70 years, and they left. She paused. They didn't talk about why to people who weren't family. But family knew. The hollow had always had something in it that wasn't right. They managed around it for 70 years and eventually decided they were done managing. She told me more than that, across the 2 hours I spent at her kitchen table, and I'm going to give you the essential pieces. The thing that walks by dark had been in that hollow, in her family's telling, for longer than the family had been there. The original knowledge of it came from the people who were in those mountains before the settlers arrived, and the settlers learned about it the same way settlers always learned about the features of a landscape they'd moved into, from the people who already knew it, and through their own experience, and by paying attention to what the land itself was telling them. The deer had always avoided the center of the hollow. The family had known this and worked around it, using the hollow's considerable resources, game, water, timber, without using the specific area around the hollow's floor that the deer didn't use. This had worked for 70 years. What changed in 1923 was something that Maddie knew only as her grandmother's telling of it, which was that the thing had begun to change its pattern. Had begun to come closer to the family's structures in the hollow, not threatening, not aggressive, but present in a way that it hadn't been present before. And the decision, made by the family elders, including her grandmother's parents, was that 70 years of managing around a thing was enough, and that the hollow had been its home before it was theirs, and they left. She said, "My grandmother said the thing that walks by dark isn't dangerous." Not exactly, but it's old, and it's in its home, and it has a patience you can't outlast. And when it starts coming closer, that's not aggression. That's it deciding something. Deciding something. I've thought about that phrase many times since March of year 13. Not aggression, a decision. I drove back from Maddie's house and I sat in the car in my own driveway for a while, and I thought about 16 years of working the southern highlands of West Virginia, and about a hollow that had been doing what it was doing since before any settlement record went back far enough to document it, and about the family that had managed around it for 70 years and then made a decision. I want to tell you about year 14, because year 14 was when the thing that walks by dark made me understand, in a specific and unmistakable way, that it knew I was the person who had been coming to that hollow for 6 years and documenting it. I was in the hollow in October, doing my fall camera card pull, alone, the same solo field work I'd been doing for years. Mid-morning, good visibility through the bare hardwood canopy, the kind of October day in the West Virginia highlands that reminds you why people choose this kind of work. I'd pulled 8 of the 12 cards in the northeastern cluster and was working toward the last 4, which were deeper in the hollow, closer to the center of the avoidance zone. At the 9th camera location, close to the avoidance zone boundary, I found the camera intact and in place. But the camera's memory card, when I pulled it and checked the thumbnail preview on my field reader, showed a sequence that I stood at the camera location looking at for close to 10 minutes before I could process what I was seeing. The camera had captured a sequence of 17 images over 2 nights. 15 of the 17 images showed deer approaching the camera location and stopping at the usual avoidance distance, as I'd been documenting for 6 years. The 16th image showed something that was not a deer standing directly in front of the camera, close enough that the camera's motion trigger had fired at point-blank range, and the image was partially overexposed from the infrared flash at that proximity. The image was not clear. Infrared trail cameras at close range produce a specific kind of image distortion that makes precise identification difficult under the best circumstances, and what I was looking at had the additional complication of being something I had no reference frame for. What I could determine from the image was large, dark, upright, and positioned in front of the camera in a way that suggested it had been standing there long enough for the camera's motion trigger to have fired and then remained still for the exposure. Not the partial blur of something passing through the frame. A still image of something that had positioned itself in front of the camera. The 17th image, taken approximately 30 seconds after the 16th based on the timestamp, showed an empty camera location. Whatever had been in front of the camera had left in the 30-second interval between the 16th and 17th images. I'm a wildlife biologist. Trail camera images are my professional medium. I've reviewed tens of thousands of trail camera images across 16 years of work, and I know exactly what the camera distortion at close range does and doesn't obscure. What it obscures is fine detail. What it doesn't obscure is the broad shape, size, and orientation of what's in the frame. What was in frame 16 of that camera card was something large, upright, and positioned facing the camera. Not a deer, not a bear, not any animal I have a reference image for in 16 years of camera work. I walked out of that hollow faster than I'd walked in. I pulled the remaining 3 camera cards without reviewing them in the field and drove to my truck and sat in it for a while. Then I drove to the county seat and found a coffee shop with Wi-Fi, and I reviewed all 4 cards on my laptop. The remaining 3 cards were normal: deer, squirrels, a single coyote, the ordinary camera footage of a functioning trail camera in active deer habitat. Only the card at location 9 had the anomalous sequence. I called Lisa that evening. I described what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It stood in front of your camera." "Yes." She said, "You've had cameras in that section for 6 years." "Yes." She said, "It knows where your cameras are." I hadn't said that. She'd arrived at it independently from the same facts I was working with. An animal, or whatever it is, that had been in that hollow for as long as Maddie's family knowledge went back, had encountered trail cameras in its territory for 6 years, had understood what they were or what they represented well enough to position itself directly in front of one at point-blank range, and had done so in the same month of the year, October, when I was in the field pulling card after card, in the specific section of my grid closest to the center of the avoidance zone. The image is in the anomalies file. I've shown it to 4 people. Harold looked at it for a long time and said nothing. Lisa looked at it and said it was consistent with what she expected. Maddie looked at it and said her grandmother had described it in terms that she'd always thought were exaggeration, but looking at the photograph, she thought her grandmother had been exactly right. And a wildlife photographer friend who knows nothing about any of this and who I showed it to under the pretense of asking his technical opinion on camera distortion looked at it and said, after close examination, "Whatever this is, it's not camera distortion." Something was standing in front of this camera. Year 15 was the year I began to seriously consider whether to continue the work or request reassignment. I've been working toward that decision, and I haven't made it yet. What I've arrived at, in the process of working toward it, is something I want to share with you because it changes how I think about everything else I've described. The deer are not wrong. This was my reframing in year 15, after 7 years of thinking about the deer in the northeastern hollow as exhibiting wrong behavior. They're not wrong. They're responding correctly to their environment. The specific responses they're making, the avoidance, the approach and turn, the complete vacancy from prime habitat, are the appropriate responses of a prey species with a well-calibrated threat assessment system to a threat that their population has been calibrating around for generations. What I've been documenting as behavioral anomaly in the deer is actually behavioral correctness. The deer are doing exactly what the deer in that hollow should do. It's my reference frame for normal deer behavior that doesn't include the variable the deer are responding to, because that variable isn't in any management textbook or any population ecology literature. The deer have always known what was in that hollow. The families who lived there for 70 years knew what was in that hollow. Maddie's grandmother knew. Harold knew enough to stop putting cameras there and stop going alone. The traditional knowledge of the people who were in those mountains before the settlers arrived knew, and passed the knowledge along in the forms that knowledge gets passed along, and some of that knowledge made it to a woman in her 70s in a small house near the county seat who made coffee for a DNR biologist on a Saturday morning in March and told him what she knew. What nobody in the management system, the DNR, the state wildlife agencies, the federal programs, knew or would acknowledge knowing was anything. The management system's picture of the deer population in the southern highlands of West Virginia doesn't include a variable for a thing that walks by dark in a specific hollow in a specific county that has been there for longer than any management system has existed. The management system manages around this vacancy the same way the deer manage around it, by going elsewhere, by treating the northeastern hollow's anomalous data as a local quirk that the standard models don't quite capture, by filing the unexplained as unexplained and moving on. I've been that management system for 16 years, doing exactly that. Filing the unexplained, moving on, coming back the following season. Year 16 is the year I'm currently in, and I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to request reassignment. What I've decided is to tell you this, because I've been sitting on this information for 8 years, and the sitting has become something I need to put down somewhere, in a form that exists outside the anomalies file on my personal laptop, where people who are in a position to do something with it can at least encounter it. What I'd want you to do with it, if you're a person in a position to do something, is this. Look at the deer data. The West Virginia DNR's population data for the county I work in has a persistent anomaly in the northeastern survey zone that no model has fully accounted for. The anomaly is real, and it's been in the data for as long as the systematic survey work has been running, which is longer than my tenure. If you know how to look at deer population data, you can find it. And if you understand what you're looking at, you'll understand that the anomaly in the deer data and the thing that positions itself in front of trail cameras in October and the 70-year family history of managing around a hollow's peculiarities and the traditional knowledge of the thing that walks by dark are all descriptions of the same thing from different angles. The deer are fine. The deer are doing what the deer should do. They're telling you exactly what's in that hollow, in the only language deer have, which is the language of where they go and where they don't. They've been telling anyone who looked carefully enough for generations. I've been looking carefully for 16 years, and I can tell you exactly where the boundary is and approximately where the center is, and what the camera footage looks like when the thing at the center decides to come close enough to the camera to be in frame. I'm still deciding whether to go back next season. The work is the work, and the work needs to be done, and the alternative is explaining to my supervisor why I want reassignment from a zone I've worked for 16 years in language that doesn't include anything I've described in this account. That's the professional reality. The personal reality is something different, which is that whatever is in that hollow positioned itself in front of my camera in October, deliberately, in the same way that the thing in Yellowstone moved toward the backcountry rangers' camp, and in the same way the thing in the Appalachian Trail section let the ridge runner see enough to know what it was dealing with. The same pattern in different landscapes, from things that have been in those landscapes for a very long time. It decided something. Maddie's grandmother's phrase. The thing that walks by dark has been in that hollow for longer than any memory goes back, and it has been deciding things about the people and the animals that share its territory, and in October of my 14th year it decided something about me, which was to be in my camera frame. I don't know what to do with that. I know what the deer do with it, which is the boundary and the avoidance and the generation-spanning behavioral inheritance of exactly where the line is. I know what the families who lived in the hollow did with it, which was 70 years of managing around it, and then a decision to leave. I know what Harold did with it, which was to stop going alone, and then to retire, and to point me toward Maddie without explaining why. What I'm doing with it is this account. And after this account, probably, the thing that I've been putting off making for 16 years, a decision about next season, made with full awareness of what I've been going to that hollow to document, and what has been, in its own time and on its own terms, documenting me. The deer are the message. They always were. They're telling you, anyone who looks at them correctly, exactly what is in the forest around them. And the thing they're telling you about in the northeastern hollow of that southern West Virginia county is old and large and present, and the deer have been right about it for longer than any human being has been close enough to understand what the deer were trying to say. Listen to the deer. Watch where they don't go. The hollow they've been avoiding for generations is a hollow you should probably avoid too, not because it will harm you, but because whatever is at its center has been there long enough to know you've arrived before you know it's watching. And that's a kind of knowledge imbalance that has no comfortable resolution. Go carefully in those southern West Virginia hollows. Come home. I want to go back and describe the camera anomalies in more precise detail, because I've been summary level about them, and the precision matters for understanding how consistent the pattern was and how early I had enough data to recognize it as something beyond ordinary variation. Trail camera networks in my study area run continuously from August through January, capturing the full arc of the hunting season plus the late winter period when I'm running population assessment transects. Each camera fires an average of 30 to 50 events per 24-hour period during the active season, which across 40 cameras gives me roughly 1,000 to 2,000 events per day across the network. In 8 years of operation, that's something in the range of 4 to 5 million individual camera events, of which I've personally reviewed somewhere between a quarter and a third directly and have had analyzed by automated sorting software. What the automated sorting software does, among other things, is flag events that don't match the expected species signature for a given camera location and time of day. The software was calibrated over several years using the baseline data from my network, and by year 6, it was accurately flagging unusual events with a false positive rate low enough to be useful. In years 7 through 12, the flagging rate in the northeastern cluster of my camera grid was consistently 2 to 3 times higher than any other cluster in the network, across every season, including winter periods when the anomalous behavioral patterns in the deer were less pronounced. 2 to 3 times more flags than any other cluster, over a 5-year period. In the specific section of my grid that overlapped with the avoidance zone Lisa, and I would later map. This is not anecdote. This is a statistical pattern in a systematic monitoring dataset, and it sits in my network's files available for anyone with access to the system to examine. What the flags represent, in the specific camera locations closest to the avoidance zone center, is events that the software couldn't assign to any known species signature. Not unusually sized deer, not bears in unusual positions, not any of the categories the software was designed to flag. Events that, when I reviewed the corresponding images, showed either partial evidence of something at the frame edge that didn't have a clear shape, or environmental disturbances, grass movement, vegetation displacement, without any visible animal, or in a smaller number of cases simply the empty scene with the trigger having fired on no observable stimulus. I am not describing ghost photographs. I am describing a monitoring dataset with a statistically significant anomaly in a specific geographic cluster, consistent across multiple years, in a section of terrain that multiple lines of independent evidence point to as behaviorally unusual. That is what the data shows, and the data is real, and it sits in a government database attached to a 16-year monitoring program that my employer funds and depends on for population management decisions. The question of what to do with that data is one I've been grappling with since year 9, when the anomaly first became large enough to be statistically significant rather than just something I was noticing informally. The answer I've arrived at, after 7 years of grappling, is that there is no clean pathway within the current management framework for presenting this data in a way that would produce a useful institutional response. The framework doesn't have a category for what the data is indicating. Without a category, The data gets absorbed into the existing categories as noise, local variation, equipment anomalies, atypical individual animal behavior, and the institution moves on. I've described this dynamic in other accounts, and I'll mention it briefly here because it's worth naming clearly. The mechanism by which unusual data disappears from institutional records is not suppression. It's categorization. The data gets filed under the nearest available category, and the nearest available category is always something that already exists, which means the unusual gets normalized by proximity to the known, and the pattern that would be visible if you compared across categories never gets compared, because nobody is maintaining a cross-category view of the anomalous. I've been maintaining that view for 8 years in my anomalies file. Nobody else has the access or the incentive to maintain it from the outside. Year 11, the year Lisa and I sat in her truck comparing notes, was also the year I began a different kind of documentation effort, which was to catalog every historical reference to the specific hollow that I could find in public records. Not because I thought historical records would explain what was there. I was long past expecting any written record to explain it, but because I wanted to know how far back the presence went, how much history had accumulated around a thing that was currently producing anomalous data in my wildlife monitoring network. What I found in the historical record was scattered and incomplete, which is what you expect when you're looking for something that the official record doesn't have a category for any more than the current one does. But there was enough of it to be useful. The oldest relevant document I found was a survey record from the 1840s, part of a land grant documentation package for a section of the Southern Highlands that included the hollow in question. The surveyor's notes, handwritten, partially illegible, transcribed by a county historical society and made available in a digitized archive, included a brief notation about a specific area of the survey that I recognized by the coordinates as corresponding to the hollow's interior. The notation read, in the careful, bureaucratic language of a 19th century government surveyor, passage through interior hollow impeded. Local guides declined to enter central section. Alternative route taken. The notation was followed by the revised survey measurements and nothing else. No explanation of why the local guides had declined. No further comment on what had impeded the passage. Local guides declined to enter central section. In 1840 survey language, this means exactly what it says. The people who knew the landscape well enough to guide a government survey team through it knew that specific section of the hollow well enough to refuse to enter it, and the surveyor accommodated that refusal without comment. The way you accommodate local knowledge you can't evaluate yourself. The next historical reference I found was from 1887, a letter in a county historical collection from a minister who'd been doing circuit work in the Southern Highlands, visiting the scattered farm families in the remote hollows. The letter was to the minister's church conference and described his circuit in general terms, but it included a passage about a family he'd visited near the hollow who had told him, in his telling, that there was something in the adjacent hollow that he took to be superstition and that he then described, with the specific discomfort of someone trying to document something that doesn't fit his framework, as follows. The family spoke of a presence in the hollow that had been known to the local people since before their settlement, which they treated with a combination of avoidance and uneasy respect, and which produced in the local wildlife a consistent pattern of avoidance that they used as an indicator for the extent of its territory. The local wildlife's avoidance as an indicator for the extent of its territory. In 1887, the same thing I'd been using my deer monitoring data to map for 8 years, described in 19th century terms by a family that had been in that landscape long enough to have developed the same practical methodology I'd developed with 16 years of professional wildlife monitoring. The third historical reference, and the one I found most significant, was in the records of a timber company that had operated in the Southern Highlands in the early 20th century. The company's cutting operations had moved through the region systematically from the late 1890s through the 1920s, taking most of the old-growth timber from the accessible hollows and ridgelines. The records I found, in a university archive, included the company's operations logs for the relevant county. The northeastern hollow appeared in those logs twice. The first appearance was in 1904, when a cutting crew was assigned to the hollow and returned to the base camp without having made their cuts, citing what the log recorded as conditions unfavorable to operation. This was unusual enough for the log keeper to note, as cutting crews in that operation didn't commonly turn back from assigned sections without completing the work. No further detail was given. The second appearance was in 1911, when the company attempted to assign the same hollow again, apparently having decided that the first crew's return was a matter of morale or management. The 1911 log entry was longer. The crew went in and spent one night at a camp near the hollow's interior. They came out the following morning, again without having made any cuts. The log recorded that the crew boss's report described the camp as having been disturbed during the night by unexplained sounds and movement, that 2 crew members had refused to return to the camp after the first night, and that the crew boss had decided the assignment wasn't worth the labor disruption and had pulled the crew. The hollow was not assigned again in any of the subsequent years of the company's operation that were represented in the archive. The timber company's records documented 2 separate attempts to work a specific hollow over 7 years, both of which resulted in crew withdrawal without completion, the second time explicitly because of something that happened at a camp in the hollow's interior on a single night. I sat with those records in the university library reading room, and I did the arithmetic. The survey record from 1840, the minister's letter from 1887, the timber company records from 1904 and 1911, Maddie's family history ending with departure in 1923, Harold's retirement in the year he stopped going into the hollow alone, and my own 16 seasons of data beginning in the year I took the assignment. Whatever is in that hollow has a documented presence going back to at least 1840, and the pattern of its presence across that entire span, the avoidance by locals, the wildlife distribution patterns, the disruption of overnight camps, has been completely consistent from the surveyor's notation to my trail camera data. Nothing about it has changed in close to 200 years of documented human interaction with that section of the southern West Virginia highlands. It has been there, doing what it does, producing the same behavioral signatures in the same landscape, across every form of human activity that landscape has seen. Let me tell you about the other deer. One of the things I've been careful not to describe in detail, because it's the thing that's hardest to put into the language of wildlife management without losing credibility entirely, is what the deer look like when you encounter them in the immediate vicinity of the avoidance zone boundary. Not in the avoidance zone, in the area just outside it, where deer are present and active, where the camera footage is normal and the track density is what the habitat supports. The deer in that boundary zone, in the years since I began paying close attention to the avoidance pattern, have a specific behavioral quality that I've come to recognize as distinct from the deer in the sections of my study area further from the hollow. It's not something obvious, not a dramatic behavioral change, not anything that would appear in a statistical analysis of camera footage. It's a quality of alertness that has a different character from the ordinary vigilance of prey animals in good habitat. Wild deer in good habitat are alert as a baseline. The deer at the boundary of the hollow's avoidance zone are alert in a way that is more sustained, less responsive to immediate environmental stimuli, and directed more consistently toward the interior of the hollow than the immediate surroundings would justify. They're watching the boundary, not watching for something approaching from the direction they came from, not watching for movement in the adjacent habitat, watching the boundary. looking into the avoidance zone with the specific, sustained attention of animals that know exactly where something is and are monitoring its position relative to theirs. I've watched deer do this at dawn, which is when it's most pronounced. Deer at the edge of the avoidance zone at dawn will have their heads oriented consistently toward the hollow interior, at intervals that have the quality of deliberate checking, in the same direction, at a regularity that doesn't match the random, environmentally driven vigilance scanning of deer in normal habitat. They know something is in there. They're keeping track of where it is relative to where they are. This is behavioral information. The deer are using their own sensory systems to monitor a presence that mine can't reliably detect. When I'm in the field at the avoidance boundary and the deer are watching the hollow, I pay attention to what they're watching, and I am more careful than I would otherwise be, because the deer's threat assessment system is better than mine in this specific context, calibrated by generations of exposure to what's there. And when the prey species in an ecosystem is running sustained monitoring behavior in a specific direction, the appropriate response for any other animal in that ecosystem is to take the monitoring seriously. I take the deer seriously. After 16 years, after the anomalies file and the historical record and Maddie's kitchen table and Harold's silence and the camera image in October of year 14, what I take most seriously is the deer. They have the most complete picture of what's in that hollow of anything that's ever been within range of it. They've been updating that picture for generations. The picture they have is expressed in the exact location of the avoidance boundary, in the consistency of the checking behavior at dawn, in the generation-spanning behavioral inheritance that produces the same responses in the deer born in the last year as in the deer that were working that boundary when I took the assignment 16 years ago. I am a wildlife biologist. The deer are, in the most literal possible sense, my primary source of information about the ecosystems I manage. What the deer in the northeastern section are telling me, in the only language they have, is something I've spent 8 years confirming from every other angle I can reach. The hollow has something in it. It has been there for a very long time. The boundary is where the deer say the boundary is. And whatever is inside that boundary has been making decisions. The word Maddie used, the word that has stayed with me most clearly from that kitchen table conversation, about the territory it occupies and the things that move through it. What I want to tell you in closing is about the camera image. Frame 16 of the card from location 9 in October of year 14. I've described the image in general terms. I want to describe it in one more specific way because there is a detail in it that I've been leaving out and that I want to include now. When I reviewed the image in the coffee shop with Wi-Fi in the county seat, I enlarged it as much as the camera's resolution allowed and examined every element of the frame. The infrared overexposure from the point-blank flash washed out detail in the central part of the image, where whatever was standing in front of the camera was largest. But at the edges, at the literal margins of the frame, where the image was less affected by the overexposure, there was detail that the central wash left visible. At the left edge of the frame, at approximately head height for whatever was standing in front of the camera, there was a portion of what I can only describe as a face, or what occupied the position where a face should be, that the overexposure hadn't entirely washed out. Not a human face, not the face of any animal I have a reference for. But in the portion that was visible, the margin of the infrared frame, the least washed section, there was an eye. Or what was in the position where an eye would be? It was oriented toward the camera. Of course it was. Whatever had positioned itself in front of my camera, in the specific location in my camera grid closest to the center of an avoidance zone I'd been mapping for 6 years, was looking at the camera. It had come to the camera and stood in front of it and looked at it. The way you'd look at something you wanted to know about. The way you'd look at a device you'd been aware of for 6 years in your territory and had finally decided to examine directly. An eye, in the margin of an infrared image, looking at the camera. I closed the laptop in the coffee shop and I sat there for a while, and then I drove home, and I've been thinking about what to do with all of this for 2 years. This account is what I've arrived at. Tell you precisely and honestly, with the full weight of 16 years of systematic professional observation behind every specific claim I've made, and let you do with it whatever you can. The deer are telling you. Listen to the deer. Watch where they go and watch where they don't, and understand that the places they don't go are not places they've overlooked or avoided by accident. They know those places. They've known them for longer than anyone watching them has known anything, and the knowledge they carry is the oldest and most reliable account we have of what is actually in those West Virginia hollows after dark. I'm going back next season. I've made that decision. The work needs to be done, and the data needs to be collected, and 16 years of a monitoring program is not a thing you walk away from without serious reason, and the reasons I have, the anomalies file, the camera image, the October encounters, all of it, are serious but not final. Not yet. But I'm not pulling camera cards from location 9 alone in October anymore. That much I've decided. Whatever comes next in that hollow, it won't come as a surprise to anyone who's been reading the deer correctly. The deer have been right all along. I'm finally giving them their full professional respect. Come home from the West Virginia hollows before dark. That's the only practical advice I have. The deer figured it out a long time ago. They were right. I want to come back to Lisa, because she's been a thread in this account that I've left somewhat loose, and she deserves more than what I've given her. Lisa and I have worked adjacent sections of the same region for 12 years. We're not close friends in the way that people who spend a lot of social time together are close. The nature of field biology work means you spend most of your time alone in the field, and your professional relationships tend to be collegial rather than intimate. But 12 years of working adjacent sections in genuinely remote country produces a specific kind of collegial trust that's hard to replicate in other work environments. And the conversation in her truck in year 11 was the kind that only happens when that trust is fully established and both parties have decided, simultaneously, to use it. After the truck conversation, we began sharing data in a way we hadn't before. Not formally. Not through the DNR's official data sharing protocols, which would have required flagging the data to supervisors and explaining why we were comparing across section boundaries. Informally, the way field biologists share data when they think they've found something interesting and want another set of eyes before they commit to any formal position. We shared the camera footage, the avoidance mapping, the mortality records, and the distribution shift data across sections in the region. What emerged from that comparison was a picture considerably larger than either of our individual sections suggested. The avoidance pattern didn't terminate at the section boundary between our areas. It extended across it, with the boundary I'd been mapping in my section connecting directly to an avoidance pattern in Lisa's section that she'd been treating as a separate local anomaly. When we overlaid both datasets, what we saw was an avoidance zone that covered close to 120 acres in total, centered on the hollow interior, extending across both our sections in a continuous oval that had been developing consistently in both datasets since approximately year 8 of my monitoring and year 6 of hers. 120 acres, 2 sections. 2 biologists, working independently, finding pieces of the same pattern. When we saw the combined map, we both sat with it quietly for a while. And then Lisa said something I want to include here because I think it's the most accurate summary anyone has given of the situation. She said, "This isn't a wildlife management problem. I don't know what it is, but it isn't that. Wildlife management deals with species, population dynamics, habitat quality, predation pressure, disease. Everything we have tools for. This doesn't fit any of those. Whatever is in that hollow is not a management problem. It's I don't know what word to use. A resident. It's a resident, and it's been there longer than any management program we'd have jurisdiction over, and our data has been mapping its presence for however many years without us having a framework for what we were mapping. A resident. She said it with the careful precision of a scientist choosing a term that fits the evidence without overcommitting to an interpretation. A resident of the hollow. Something that occupies that space the way a resident occupies a space, with tenure, with established patterns, with the behavioral impact on the surrounding ecosystem that long, stable residence produces. I've used the word presence throughout this account, and Lisa's word resident is more precise. A presence is something you sense. A resident is something that lives there. What's in that hollow is a resident. It has been a resident longer than the county has been a county, longer than West Virginia has been a state, longer than European settlement has been in those mountains. The deer have been calibrating their behavior around its residency across generations. The families that farmed those hollows learned to accommodate its residency across decades. The timber company learned, in 2 failed attempts, that cutting operations in its residential territory didn't work. And now Lisa and I have spent years, between us, mapping the extent of its residence with the tools of 21st century wildlife monitoring and arriving at a picture that matches, to a degree that is itself significant, the pictures assembled by the people who came before us with their own tools, traditional knowledge, family memory, survey notation, timber company operations logs. The resident is in its home. We're the visitors. The deer understood this first, and they've been showing anyone who looked carefully enough exactly where the property line is. I also want to tell you about what happened in year 15 when I met the county sheriff. The encounter was incidental. I was getting fuel at a county station and the sheriff pulled in for the same reason, and we got talking the way people in small counties get talking, about nothing in particular, about the season and the weather and the deer harvest numbers I'd been collecting at the check station. He'd been sheriff in that county for 12 years, which meant he'd been sheriff when I was establishing my camera network and running my first surveys in the northeastern section. At some point he mentioned, in passing, that there was a section of county road in the southern district that he didn't send deputies on alone at night. Not a formal policy, nothing in any manual or official protocol. Just a practice he'd established, he said, because of 2 separate incidents with deputies who'd reported experiencing something on that road that had, in both cases, produced a welfare concern that had required him to take the deputies off night rotation temporarily while they got their heads right. I asked where the road was. He described it. I knew it. It ran along the ridge above the hollow, one of the county roads I used for access to my field sites. He didn't elaborate beyond what he'd said, and I didn't ask him to. But before we parted, he said something that I want to include verbatim because I've written it down and I know it's accurate. He said, "Something's been in that country a long time, longer than any of us. The people who grew up here know not to push on it. The people who come in from outside usually figure it out eventually. Something's been in that country a long time," said by the county sheriff, in a gas station parking lot, as an incidental fact rather than as anything he felt the need to elaborate on. A piece of local knowledge, carried in the informal understanding of someone whose job put him in close enough contact with the county's landscape and its people to have absorbed the knowledge that the landscape held. He knows. The way Harold knew, the way Maddie knew, the way the timber company crew boss knew when he pulled his men from the hollow in 1911 and wrote it in the operations log, and nobody at the company's head office asked why. The knowledge exists in the county, distributed through the informal channels that carry things that don't have official categories, held by the people whose jobs and whose families and whose land put them close enough to the territory to have encountered the evidence. I'm a wildlife biologist who has been in that territory for 16 years. I've accumulated enough of the evidence that the informal knowledge has become available to me in the way it becomes available to people who stay long enough. Harold pointed me toward Maddie. The sheriff offered his observation without being asked. The timber company records were there to find in the archive. The survey notation was in the digitized historical record. The knowledge wanted to be found. Or rather, the knowledge was findable by anyone who stayed long enough and paid close enough attention and was willing to receive it from the sources it existed in. I received it. This account is what I've done with it. There is one more thing I want to tell you about a discovery I made in the last week before I decided to write this account. I've been working in the DNR's data system, which holds 16 years of my monitoring records and considerably more from the biologists who preceded me in this region. I was doing routine data work, cross-referencing my monitoring data with historical harvest data from the county's deer checking stations going back to the 1970s, when I found something in the harvest data that I should have looked for years ago and didn't think to look for until the anomalies file had grown large enough that the pattern was obvious. The harvest data for the county goes back 50 years. It covers the entire county, broken down by management zone, which in our system corresponds roughly to township-level geography. The management zone that includes the northeastern hollow, the same zone my camera grid covers, shows a consistent, statistically significant low harvest anomaly going back to the 1970s. Not low overall deer density in the zone. The population estimate for the zone is comparable to adjacent zones. Low harvest. Fewer deer killed by hunters in that zone than adjacent zones with similar population estimates and similar hunter access. The reason for low harvest in a zone with normal deer density and normal hunter access is low hunter success. Low hunter success with normal deer density means the deer in that zone are avoiding the specific locations where hunters hunt them. In most zones, that means hunters have overscouted or the deer have patterned to the hunting pressure. In this zone, with an anomaly going back 50 years, predating any specific management decision or hunting pressure pattern that would explain it, the most consistent explanation is that the deer in the zone are avoiding a specific part of the zone, which reduces the effective habitat available for hunting in ways that depress overall harvest without changing population density. The deer have been avoiding the hollow's center for as long as the county has been keeping systematic harvest records. The harvest data has been showing it for 50 years. It's been in the record, available to any biologist who looked at it with the right question in mind, since before I was born. I've told my supervisor that I found an interesting harvest anomaly in the historical data and that I'm going to do a more detailed analysis. She said that sounds worthwhile. I'm going to do the analysis. I'm going to write it up properly, and the analysis, written correctly, will show a 50-year harvest anomaly in a specific section of a specific county that has no explanation in any of the management variables that harvest anomalies are normally attributed to. It won't name what causes the anomaly. The data doesn't name it. The analysis will describe it in exactly the terms that wildlife management uses for things it can observe but can't fully explain. But the description will be in the official record, in a formal analysis, contributing to the body of documented evidence that already includes my anomalies file and Lisa's avoidance mapping and Harold's camera records and Maddie's family history and the sheriff's observation and the surveyor's notation from 1840. The picture has been building for a very long time. It keeps adding pieces. The deer, as always, knew first. Listen to the deer. Whatever they're avoiding, give it the same distance they give it. They've been right about this hollow for longer than any human being has been in those mountains. They'll be right about it long after I've filed my last report and driven out of those southern West Virginia hollows for the last time. Come home from the hollow before dark. The deer can tell you exactly when that needs to happen. They know the boundary. They've always known the boundary. That's 16 years. That's what the deer were telling me. I haven't told you about what happens to the deer at night near the avoidance zone boundary, and I want to tell you about that specifically because it adds something to the picture that the camera data and the distribution studies don't capture as clearly. Trail cameras capture still images or short video clips when triggered by motion. They capture what happens in a specific 3 to 5 foot wedge of space in front of the lens when something moves through it. What they don't capture is the ambient behavior of deer in the wider landscape around the camera, the continuous behavioral stream that you only get from direct observation. In my 13th and 14th seasons, I spent several nights in the field near the avoidance zone boundary, specifically to observe the night behavior of deer at the boundary from a position that would give me sight lines that no camera arrangement could provide. I positioned myself in a ground blind on a slight rise above the hollow floor, with a view across about 300 meters of the transition zone between the normal habitat and the avoidance zone center. I had a night vision monocular, and I ran several hours of observation on each visit. What I observed during those nights is the most direct behavioral data I've personally collected on what the deer in that section are doing relative to the avoidance zone. And what I observed was this. The deer that used the transition zone at night consistently oriented their primary attention toward the avoidance zone center from approximately 90 minutes before dawn through dawn itself until full light. Not continuously, they fed and moved and engaged in normal night behavior. But their checking behavior, the periodic interruptions of other activity to look in a specific direction, was oriented toward the center of the hollow throughout the pre-dawn period. What made this more significant than ordinary vigilance was the synchrony. When I had multiple deer visible simultaneously, which happened on 3 of the 6 nights I observed, the checking behavior happened simultaneously. All 3 or 4 deer would pause feeding at approximately the same moment and orient in the same direction. Not triggered by a sound or a movement I could detect, just together, as if responding to the same stimulus simultaneously, the kind of behavioral synchrony in prey species that indicates they're all receiving the same information from the same source at the same time. The source they were all oriented toward was the avoidance zone center. The pre-dawn hour, roughly 90 minutes before first light, was when the synchrony was most pronounced and most consistent. And the direction they were all looking was the same direction I've been calling the center of the avoidance zone throughout this account, the center that corresponds to the thermal feature in my camera grid, the center where frame 16 of the October year 14 card was taken. 90 minutes before dawn, multiple deer, simultaneously orienting toward the same point in the hollow. I don't know what they were responding to that I couldn't detect with a night vision monocular and a field biologist's attention. I know they were responding to something. The synchrony is too consistent and too directional to be coincidence, and the temporal consistency, 90 minutes before dawn, not earlier and not later, suggests the behavior was tied to something that happened at that specific time on the nights I observed. In the traditional knowledge that Maddie relayed from her grandmother, the name of what lived in that hollow translated as the thing that walks by dark. In the Appalachian traditions of the Southern Highlands more broadly, and in the traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples who knew those mountains before the settlement period, the pre-dawn hours are described consistently as the transition time, the period when the things that belong to the dark are returning to wherever they go when it's light. The deer's pre-dawn orienting behavior, the consistent directional attention beginning 90 minutes before first light, could be read, in a traditional ecological knowledge framework, as exactly what it looks like: prey animals tracking the return of something to its daytime location as dawn approaches. I'm a scientist. I don't interpret field data through traditional ecological knowledge frameworks without also subjecting it to standard biological analysis. But I also know that traditional ecological knowledge is often a more complete account of ecological reality than formal science has yet been able to document, because traditional knowledge systems accumulate observations across longer time periods and with more consistent attention to specific locations than any formal monitoring program can sustain. The pre-dawn orienting behavior in the boundary deer and the traditional knowledge of a thing that walks by dark and returns before dawn are describing the same observation from two different documentation systems. Both systems are pointing at the same reality. I want to describe one more encounter before I tell you about the research analysis I'm going to publish, and this encounter is the most recent one. It happened in October of my 16th year, 3 weeks before I decided to write this account. I was at location 9. Against the decision I'd made after year 14, I was alone. I won't justify the decision because it doesn't fully justify, except to say that I'd been thinking about what comes next for several months, and there was something unresolved that I needed to close before I could move on from this section of the story, which was whether the October year 14 camera event was anomalous or whether it was the beginning of a pattern. I arrived at location 9 in the late afternoon, and I sat against a tree about 30 meters from the camera, downwind, in the kind of cover that experienced field biologists know how to use to reduce their apparent presence in a landscape. I was not hiding from the camera. I was simply present, in the way that you're present when you're waiting to see what the landscape does when you're quiet enough. For close to 3 hours, nothing happened that would have been out of place in any section of my study area. Deer moved through at dusk, used the surrounding area in the normal pre-rut activity patterns of a mid-October evening, triggered the camera several times with perfectly ordinary footage. The hollow was a hollow. The avoidance zone center, in the darkness beyond my sight lines, was quiet. At approximately 9 in the evening, the deer that had been active in the transition zone near my position stopped. Not fled, stopped. The specific stopping of prey animals responding to a stimulus that requires full attention, every animal present going still simultaneously. The synchrony I'd observed in my pre-dawn night watches compressed into a sudden collective freeze. I went still too, not a conscious decision. The same reflex that keeps you motionless when 3 prey animals have simultaneously decided to pay full attention to whatever they've detected. Then, from the direction of the avoidance zone center, the sound. Low, very low. Below comfortable hearing range into the register you feel rather than hear, sustained for close to 10 seconds, and then silence. The deer, all of them simultaneously, oriented toward the sound, held their orientation for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the nearest one, a doe that had been feeding within 15 meters of my position, looked directly at me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. The doe was not looking in my general direction. She was looking at me, specifically, with the direct eye contact that deer make when they've identified a specific object of interest rather than a general area of concern. She held that direct eye contact for close to 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds I understood something. in the way that you understand things in the field when your pattern recognition is running at full speed and the pattern is one you haven't encountered before. The deer knew I was there, not because I'd revealed myself. I'd been in that position for 3 hours in good cover. They'd known I was there the entire time, the way deer know where everything in their immediate environment is, and they'd been going about their evening activity with that knowledge as background information. What the doe was doing in the direct eye contact after the vocalization was something different. She was showing me that she knew I was there, in the same moment that the vocalization had reminded everything in the hollow that something else knew where everything was too. She looked at me for 5 seconds. Then she turned and walked, not ran, walked, in the direction away from the avoidance zone center. The other deer followed. Within a minute, the immediate vicinity of location 9 was empty of deer. And I sat against my tree in the dark, alone, 30 meters from a camera that had captured an unknown large upright animal standing in front of it the previous October, in a hollow that has a documented presence going back to an 1840 survey notation, and I stayed there for a while and listened to whatever might be using the hollow now that the deer had moved out, and I heard nothing. Or nothing I could put a name to. I drove out at 11. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened the anomalies file and I typed up the October 16th year observation in the same careful, precise language I've been using for 8 years, and when I finished I looked at what I'd typed and I felt, for the first time in 8 years of looking at that file, that it was complete enough to share. This account is that sharing. Everything in it is accurate. The camera data, the avoidance mapping, the historical records, the conversations with Harold and Maddie and Lisa and the sheriff. The doe's direct eye contact and the low-frequency vocalization and the emptied hollow and the drive home at 11. All of it is as close to accurate as I can make it across 16 years of careful professional observation in terrain that most people never enter, and that, if they entered it, most would pass through quickly without noticing the specific quality of attention the deer were paying to a section of hollow floor that they didn't use. Listen to the deer. I know I've said it before in this account, and I'm saying it again because it's the truest thing I know about what I've spent 16 years documenting. The deer are right. They have always been right. The hollow is what the deer say it is, and the deer say it's not theirs, and they've been saying it every morning at 90 minutes before first light when they orient their collective attention toward the center of it and check whether what lives there is still where it was. It is. It has been. It will be. Come home from the West Virginia hollows before dark. There are 3 things I haven't told you that belong in this account, and I'm going to tell them now because the account is nearly complete and they each add something to the picture that the picture needs. The first is about disease surveillance. Part of my job for 16 years has been collecting tissue and blood samples from harvested deer for the state's chronic wasting disease and other disease monitoring programs. This involves processing harvest samples at check stations during hunting seasons and occasionally collecting opportunistic samples from mortality sites I find in the field. I've processed thousands of samples across 16 seasons. In the northeastern section, within the avoidance zone boundary, I have had 1 direct mortality sample and 1 opportunistic collection opportunity in 16 years. The direct mortality was the carcass I described from year 10. The opportunistic collection was a mortality I found in year 12, again inside the avoidance zone. That was in a state that precluded useful sample collection. In 16 years of systematic deer mortality surveillance across my study area, the 2 mortalities I've found inside the avoidance zone are the only mortalities I've found there. The rest of the mortalities I document annually: vehicle strikes, hunting wounds, predation events, disease mortality, occur outside the avoidance zone. This is another way of saying that deer don't die inside the avoidance zone in the ordinary ways. They don't get hit by vehicles inside it because they don't go in it. They don't die of hunting wounds inside it because hunters don't successfully take deer there. They don't show predation mortality inside it because the predators in the ecosystem, black bear, coyote, use the avoidance zone at rates similar to the deer. What dies inside the avoidance zone dies in ways that don't match the standard mortality categories, as the year 10 carcass demonstrated, and dies rarely enough that in 16 years of active surveillance, I've found 2 examples. Whatever happens to animals that enter the avoidance zone center is not what happens to animals in the surrounding habitat. That's the disease surveillance data telling me something. I don't know exactly what it's telling me, but it's consistent with everything else. The center of the avoidance zone is categorically different from the surrounding habitat in ways that multiple data streams are pointing at. The second thing is about the cameras I pulled from the northeastern cluster after year 14. I pulled 4 cameras from the cluster closest to the avoidance zone center in year 15, relocating them to positions further out in the transition zone. The official reason I gave was to optimize the spatial coverage of the monitoring network. The actual reason was that I was no longer comfortable having cameras in positions that something large and upright might be standing in front of, looking at, making decisions about. I want to be honest about that decision because it's relevant. I made a choice, in year 15, to reduce my monitoring presence in the section of the study area where the most significant observations had been occurring, and the reason for that choice was not scientific. It was something closer to respect, or something closer to the recognition that there are limits to what I should be observing from the inside of a territory that belongs to something else. The Crow elder told Delgado no further investigation. Maddie's family left the hollow. Harold stopped going alone. I pulled the cameras. I'm not certain that was the right decision. I'm certain it was the decision that felt right, and that in a situation where all the other signals, the deer behavior, the traditional knowledge, the historical record, the informal knowledge of the people who've lived alongside this territory, are pointing at the same general approach, the feeling that pulling the cameras was right carries more weight than it might in a different context. The third thing is about something Lisa said in the most recent conversation we had about the northeastern section, which was in the spring of my 16th year. Lisa has been doing her own thinking about the combined data set across the 4 years since we compared notes in her truck. She's arrived at a position that I think is more complete than anything I've been able to articulate on my own, and I want to give it to you in her words because she said it better than I would. She said, "We've been treating this as an anomaly in the deer data. It's not an anomaly. It's a signal. The deer population in that section has been generating a signal about the hollow for as long as the data goes back, and probably longer. The signal is completely consistent, it's spatially precise, it's temporally stable, and it corresponds with independent lines of evidence from historical records and traditional knowledge that weren't derived from the deer data at all. This is the most well-corroborated thing in either of our datasets. It's not anomalous. It's the clearest signal in the whole picture. The clearest signal in the whole picture. The deer, doing what deer do in a landscape with a specific resident that they've learned about across generations, have been producing the clearest, most consistent, most independently corroborated signal in 16 years of systematic wildlife monitoring data in the southern West Virginia highlands. I'm a wildlife biologist. I know how to read a signal in a dataset. I've spent 16 years reading signals in the deer population data of my study area. The signal Lisa described is real, and it's clear, and I've been reading it for 8 years since it became statistically visible in my anomalies file. The deer are telling us exactly what's in that hollow. They have been telling anyone who looked carefully enough, in the only language available to them, for longer than any formal monitoring program has existed. What they're saying is, there is something in this hollow that has been here since before we were here, and it is large, and it is old, and its home is here, and we give it its space. That's what the deer are saying. That's what 16 years of data says. That's what the surveyors and the ministers and the timber companies and the farming families and the retired biologist and the county sheriff and the woman at the kitchen table say. Listen to the deer. Come home. I want to close with something that isn't about the deer or the hollow or the data. Something about what 16 years of this work has produced in me as a person, because that's part of the honest account too. I came into this job believing, in the way that people who've spent years in formal scientific education believe things without fully examining them, that the natural world was essentially knowable. Not completely known. Obviously there were gaps, new species being described every year, behavioral ecology still yielding surprises even in well-studied systems. But knowable in principle, amenable to the methodologies I'd been trained in, eventually reducible to a picture that science and management together could make complete. 16 years in the southern West Virginia highlands have produced a different belief, or something more precise than belief, something closer to a conclusion drawn from direct evidence. The natural world is not essentially knowable in the way I assumed. There are things in it that have been in specific landscapes for longer than any monitoring program or any formal knowledge system has existed, that have left their marks on the landscape in ways that the data records and the traditional knowledge and the informal networks all register, and that have never been formally named or described or studied because the framework for doing that work doesn't yet exist. They're there in the data. The data is there in the databases. The databases are full of signals that nobody has assembled into the right question, because the right question requires a cross-categorical view that no single institution is equipped to maintain. I've been maintaining that view for 8 years, in a personal file on a personal laptop, and the view has produced a picture that I am as certain of as I am of anything in 16 years of professional wildlife monitoring. There is something in a specific hollow in a specific county in West Virginia. It has been there for at least 2 centuries of documented evidence, and likely much longer. It is large, it is intelligent in some sense of that word, it is making decisions about its territory and the things that move through it. The deer have been right about it for generations. The people who lived alongside it for generations were right about it. The people whose traditional knowledge of those mountains goes back before the settlement period were right about it. And the wildlife data is right about it, as accurately as wildlife data has ever been right about anything in 16 years of systematic collection. The deer are not wrong. The deer are the signal. The signal is clear. That's 16 years. That's what the data says. Go carefully in those southern West Virginia hollows. Come home before dark, and whatever you do, listen to the deer. They know. One last note, because I want this account to be useful to anyone who finds it. The 50-year harvest anomaly in the management zone data is findable if you know where to look. I'm going to publish the analysis within the year. When it appears in the state wildlife management literature, it will be the first formal documentation of the avoidance pattern in an official record. It won't explain what causes the anomaly. The data doesn't require that explanation to stand on its own as a statistically significant finding. but it will be in the record. The deer will finally be in the record in a way that requires a response. The deer have been waiting a long time for someone to write it down correctly. I'm going to try to do that. It's the least I can do for 16 years of signals I should have understood sooner. Listen to the deer. They know. To the researchers reading this who work with population data in the Southern Appalachians, pull the harvest data by zone for the counties in your region and look for persistent low harvest anomalies in zones where population density estimates don't account for the harvest gap. They're in more data sets than just West Virginia. I've had informal conversations with biologists in 3 adjacent states who have found similar patterns. Nobody has formally compared them. Nobody has asked the right question across state lines. The regional picture, if someone assembled it, would be considerably larger than any individual state's data suggests. The deer are telling the same story in multiple states. The story is consistent. Someone needs to write it down at scale. I'm starting with West Virginia. Someone else can take the regional view. Come home from those hollows. The deer will tell you exactly when. 16 years. 1 hollow. 1 resident. Countless deer telling the same story to anyone who would read it correctly. I finally read it correctly. That's all.